Hi, I'm Anna. I'm an independent longevity researcher with newscience.org, which is, yes, that's weird. Don't ask, it's a long story. But I wanted to take some time to go over some of the common objections I hear people making when I tell them that I'm working on radical human lifespan extension. Because I think that, honestly, a lot of them are not addressed in much depth or detail by a bunch of people in this community. And, I'm a scientist to some extent, but my sincere wish is to make radical sweeping changes to the way that we live our lives. I cannot possibly just brush away these important social questions that people keep asking. So I want to take this video and the next one to go through a bunch of the arguments that I've heard and what my take on them is. And then after that, this is the stuff that gets me really excited. We're going to go in depth into molecular biology of aging, some really in-the-weeds cell bio stuff, which is like my molecular computational biologist, like that shit, that is my bread and butter. But one thing, so I think that when I'm addressing these questions, I'm gonna be taking the stance that human lifespan extension is good in and of itself. I think that, well, for one thing, a common objection that I hear is the idea that there is a distinction between lifespan and health span. Like, when you tell people that you're working on longevity, their immediate concern is, well, if I get a longevity drug when I am 70 years old, how am I going to... am I going to be stuck in a 70-year-old's body? Am I going to be living forever in the body of a 70-year-old? And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. One of the core premises of almost every instance of longevity research is that the thing that makes being 70 years old suck is the fact that you are aging, and aging is what causes death. If you're able to make people live longer, that requires resolving all of the things that are eventually result in them dying, and those are the same things that contribute to dysfunction, to your joints hurting, to all kinds of chronic conditions. All of those are downstream of the same fundamental issues. So as a result, human lifespan extension is, in healthcare, making people younger is resolving chronic health issues. It means preventing Alzheimer's. It means preventing dementia. It means reducing how often people's bones are breaking when they fall. It means enabling people who are 70 years old, 80 years old, to go out and walk around the way that they did when they were 20. And it means that they get to do that. We all get to do that for much, much longer. For a really clear demonstration of this, look into the Frailty Index by Kenneth Rockwood. The Frailty Index is throw 30 different measurements of things that can be wrong with people into a bucket, and come up with a single index, a single number, convert all of those things into a single number. And this turns out to be a really useful thing to do, because it's predictive of a whole bunch of stuff, including mortality. To be clear, this is a measurement of dysfunction, this is a measurement of disability, and a measurement of disability is a measurement of your degree of mortality, of the likelihood that you are going to die soon. One of the really fun things about this is that your overall level of disability, you can calculate Frailty Index without, for example, one of the things they do is they calculate the Frailty Index, but without any specific cardiovascular health measures. So it is a random set of disabilities, but no measures of cardiovascular health. And what they get out of this is that this index is a better predictor of someone's chances of having a stroke in the next year or so, sorry, not 5 or 10 years, in the next year or so, than just using those specific cardiovascular health measures, even though those measures were excluded from the index. All dysfunction is connected through fundamentally the same mechanisms. That dysfunction is what makes aging miserable. That dysfunction is why we die in the first place. Stopping aging is good for people. The second arguments that you often get are arguments around overpopulation. I'm somewhat sympathetic to these arguments, but the first thing to establish, obviously, is that estimates are that global fertility, global fertility rates are going to decline. Based on all of the trajectories that we're on at the moment, there will be a peak in the human population, and then the human population will slowly start declining. And I know that there are lots of people online who have strong opinions about this for reasons that I entirely understand people being leery of. But it is the case, quite consistently so far, that as countries get richer, as people get richer, they start having fewer children. And as they start having fewer children, the number of children that they're having is less than the number of people that are dying every year. This is the case in most rich Western countries. It will be the case as developing countries become richer and richer. And so, at the moment, the human population, as things stand right now, is decidedly finite. There is and obviously not necessarily the case that will hold if we have these longevity drugs and they work really, really well, then potentially the global death rate will be negligible, and so any number of kids increases the human population. But these are very, very long-term concerns. These are concerns that are decades out from here. And so, whilst I think that they are concerns worthy of serious consideration, I'm also not terribly convinced that it's an argument against working on longevity right now. I think we should be considering these problems, but I think that these are problems that will only arise once we've solved death in the first place. And then the next thing that people will usually say is something along the lines of science advances one funeral at a time. And so I looked at this. There was one study that I could find, I'll link it in the description. There was one study that I could find that did seem to suggest that the deaths of quote-unquote superstar scientists resulted in a decrease in publications from their collaborators and an increase in publications from people outside of the field bringing in new ideas. And, okay, sure, I am not convinced that this is particularly important. Because it was a small bump. It was like an 8% bump. I'm just not convinced that outweighs the fact that we can potentially get at the root cause of so much of human illness, of so much of human misery. Death is miserable. Aging is miserable. Dying is miserable. And so I'm not terribly concerned by the idea that founder effects in science are so enormous that they outweigh that. I can understand if you have a different perspective, but I also think you might be insane. So the next issue here is drug pricing. The people will say, well, okay, but if these drugs exist, then they will only be for the rich. And my rebuttal to that is, you are assuming a degree of underlying logic to pharmaceutical pricing that does not exist. I fucking hate Like, it's, that's being facetious, but it's also, I, there are a number of papers that I've looked at that were trying to identify the core drivers of pharmaceutical pricing, like drug pricing, and none of them come to strong conclusions. Like, there's some very baseline, obvious stuff, but the things that actually result in drugs being priced the way they are so variable and based on so many idiosyncrasies of policy and of the specific kind of drug. There are there are a couple of things that do matter. So the obvious one is patents. Patents do in fact increase the cost of drugs. And I will say that every single person that I've met working on longevity, working in this space, is broadly against patents. They do not like patent system. They do not like IP law. I am generally in favour of massive IP law reform, but I also don't think that drug patents are a particular reason to be worried about some kind of dystopian society full of very long-lived rich people subjugating a much smaller group of poor people. And that is on the basis that in most countries with a much saner system than the United States, most countries, their governments negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical manufacturers. And the thing is that for longevity drugs, for drugs that are like increasing human lifespan, there is a huge incentive for governments to negotiate prices so that these drugs are as widespread as possible, because aging is expensive. Again, aging is the primary cause of almost all chronic conditions. Older people use the healthcare system so much more than younger people, and in particular, the thing that's really expensive is that older people are much more likely to have multiple chronic conditions simultaneously. That is really expensive to treat. If you have drugs that can just fully generally extend human lifespan, then that's huge. We could massively reduce our degree of healthcare spending by doing that. And so I strongly suspect that once we get good longevity drugs on the market, you will see something similar to what's happened with Ozempic and Wegovy, where like everyone wants this drug. Pharmaceutical manufacturers are pumping it out constantly, and it's generally accessible, although Ozempic pricing is one of the things that drove me nuts when I was researching this, so take that with a pinch of salt, I guess. There is one obvious concern here, there's one much bigger concern, which is access in developing countries. Now again, I think there are reasons to be reassured here, or, well, reassured is perhaps the wrong term, but there's a WHO report where they explicitly note that one of the reasons why insulin is relatively inaccessible in Zambia and in various other low-income countries is because of opportunity cost. Diabetes is not a rare disease, but when you have very limited money to spend on healthcare, then 1% of the population, a drug that is only suitable for 1% of the population, is not necessarily the best thing to be spending your money on. And so developing countries are able to justify spending a lot fewer resources on acquiring things like insulin, and acquiring these drugs that are, like, for a large number of people, but still an overall small portion of the population. And so pricing there is difficult. This obviously will not be the case for longevity drugs. Now, naturally, that doesn't mean that everything here is going to be fine. In general, they will not be able to afford these drugs as much as Western countries are, and especially it will be harder to justify because old age is a much less significant cause of disease and healthcare spending in developing countries as compared to Western nations. So there will still be a meaningful opportunity cost associated with these longevity drugs. And I entirely sympathetic and do not think it's unreasonable to be concerned about the potential that radical human lifespan extension could be yet another in a pile of things that ends up deepening the gap in living conditions, in wealth, between developing countries and wealthier Western nations. I don't think that this is an argument against working on longevity in general. I do think that it is a very strong argument in favour of doing as much work as we can to change the way that drug procurement works and to change the way that pharmaceutical pricing works. But I think it's completely fair to be worried about this. It also links into the other question that I think I mentioned at the start of this video, that I want to give its own video because I think it is one of the more powerful objections, which is that the question of regime stability in dictatorial regimes. From what I can tell, it is very much the case that the worst kinds of dictatorships are significantly destabilized by the natural death of their leaders. And I think this is a very reasonable thing to be concerned about. I want to do a little bit more reading on this topic, and so that I address it in a separate video and make sure I know what I'm talking about. But it is certainly my biggest concern with the prospect of radical human lifespan extension. I think that, in general, enabling of totalitarian states is a really big problem with any kind of technological development, and it is something that everyone working on these technological developments, Sam Altman, needs to be thinking very carefully about. But I want to give that its own space. So, anyway, I hope this has given you at least a different perspective on longevity. I hope this has perhaps gotten you to understand a little bit more about why people like me care so much about radical human lifespan extension. And also, just like, I want to live forever. Or, I mean, not literally forever, but like, 100 years is not enough, assuming I get 100 years. And 100 years of, like, not of varyingly healthy lifespan, sure as hell not enough. There are so many cool things in the universe, and I want to be there to see all of them. And I acknowledge that part of that is going to be creating a society that enables that. But I want to actually, make sure we can do it. So,